always thinking about what it is that we want them to learn. And I want to shift our mindset a little bit to getting them to be learning about things that they want to learn and that they are actually excited about learning it, right? I'm going to put some practices into the chat really quickly here, and we'll talk about these in a second. But if you're not already with a pencil and paper or pen and paper, if you don't have that with you, you should maybe have that so you can be making these notes and answering these questions for yourself. There's a lot of research that supports engaging the brain using your hands when you're thinking. So that's something that I encourage you to do. I'd also like you to ask yourself a question. So right now, while you have that pen and paper in front of you and you have it in your hand, think about one question you're trying to answer today, whether it's with this session or another session or something else in your life. What is one question that you are trying to answer for yourself today? And then the final thing is for you to identify one takeaway from any session that you've had today. So those are your 3 tasks for the next 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes, and we'll leave some time for questions. But making sure that you actually use some pencil and paper to engage your brain. And if you're typing notes, that's okay too. You're still using your hands to engage your brain. What is one question you're trying to answer today? And then identify one takeaway from any session that you've attended today, or look for one while we have this conversation today. There's so much great stuff in terms of what you're doing in the classroom, editing videos, apps to work with your classroom, learning Italian. Oh, that sounds wonderful. I can only learn languages when I'm in other places. And so it's really hard right now for me to be boning up on any of the other languages, but that's great stuff to be learning. Okay, here's the big question that I'd like for us to start to think about today. What does it mean to be an educator? And if it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and move us all into some breakout rooms really quickly to answer this question. What does it mean to be an educator? Sorry, I'm going to go through all of them and then I'll drop them into the chat so that you've got them. But when we think about what it means to be an educator and what that role is, I want to make sure that we are really considering what that means, not just for now or for the big philosophical question, but what does it mean to you to be an educator? So that's the first question. The second question I want you to ask is, what do we want for the future of humanity and our global community? That's a really important thing for us to be thinking about. We know one thing for sure from this pandemic, like it or not, we are one global community. And apologies for the American part in that. In the past year, we haven't done a good job, but I really feel strongly that we have to be thinking about ourselves for what we want for humanity and our global community. The next question is, how can we shift education to better reflect mindsets and as the global mindsets that we're talking about? And then how does individualized learning support our global goals for education and humanity? And that might be a deeper question for some of you, but thinking about how we can better reflect our global mindsets in the way we work for education. And then finally, what are learning practices we can develop for our dynamic world? So I'm just going to ask you I'm going to drop those questions right into the chat right now. Thanks for your patience while I do so. So it's there. If you want to copy those and grab them, I'll also push them out into the breakout rooms in just 1 second, and I'm going to just randomly send you out into breakout rooms. So. Okay, in your rooms, please work on the conversation. Think about those questions, and it's just up to you in terms of how you're going to share, but I encourage you to get into that discussion. We're only going to spend about 6 minutes in this discussion, so make sure everybody has an opportunity to have a conversation, maybe 7 minutes. Okay, off we go. Thanks all. Here's the thing that I noticed. I just popped in quickly to a couple of the rooms just to see what was going on in the conversation. And all of the rooms I popped into were talking about taking care of each other in some form or fashion. That was the main theme that kind of came up. Like, we want this for humanity. We want this for society. We're doing this as educators without even thinking about it, but we need to be more specific and focused, I think, in how we are approaching that. So I feel really strongly that we are doing a good job of at least taking care of each other and thinking about the emotions. So bravo to you. If you've done nothing else today, you've already thought about the humanity of all of us. So I'm just going to move ahead a little bit here in terms of what we want for a global mindset so that we can shift into just the three main focuses of this. Global mindset to me really has to do with just that we are all in this together. We're all in this conference that is an international conference. There's a lot of good conversation, but that global mindset for our learners and for our students is a little more difficult. Even if they're a well-traveled young person, they still have to be coached in how to do these processes. One of the things that I like to do to move in the direction of a global mindset is use the 17 sustainable goals from the UN. This is free. It's easy to find online. If you're not already using this, it's a fantastic set of tools. They have a bunch of resources for you. But one of the things that I like about using the global goals in the classroom and in terms of increasing a global mindset, increasing critical thinking, as well as the individualized learning practices, is that the global goals are relatable to every single human, right? Everybody wants to have all of these goals on their list. So I think it's really important for us to maybe consider what that means and to start to think about that mindset and open up our thinking a little bit more strongly in terms of what these global messages are and what's happening. And I love that, so somebody just dropped into the chat that there's the service learning around these global goals. And I think that that's amazing, right? Because it's a great place to start the conversation. Project-based learning is fantastic. Project-based learning that is service-oriented is even better. Project-based learning that is service-oriented and allows for there to be a connection at this global scale, that's what we're looking for. And that's what I aim on in terms of the individualized learning process. So for me, the global mindset is necessary because we're all in this together. And we learned that very, very heavily in the recent year. Sorry, my screen doesn't go quickly through these. Maybe there. There we go. I'm going to move into a little bit of the reason why individualized learning matters. And I bring that up and I use that word specifically. We talk a lot about differentiated education where there is a little bit of room for students who learn differently. I worked a long time with students who have learning disabilities. And so that matters for what we talk about with differentiation and providing different modalities of learning. Personalized learning is a lot more voice and choice in the learning. We still have some control and some thought about it, but we're moving the students into that empowerment of them owning their own learning by giving them a lot of voice and choice in the personalized process. Individualized learning to me is the very specific students owning and building their own learning process. So when I did this in the classroom, it was 100% start to finish the students building it themselves. And we'll talk a little bit about the one main tool that I use. I'll give that to you. It's just a project thinking template, getting them to think about who they are and what they're passionate about and what matters to them, as well as moving into this place of purpose. That's what individualized learning is to me. But I'm going to talk a little bit about why. The 6 agreed upon principles of learning from the OECD, and this is taken directly from Tracy Takahama Espinosa from the Mind Brain Education Institute at Harvard. But over 30 years and thousands of participants, students in participation in this study from all different countries. So I think it was 70 something different countries that were involved in this study, in a long study. They came up with these 6 agreed upon principles of learning. That uniqueness matters, of course. We know this, all of our brains are different and we all learn differently. We have different potentials. Our context, our choice, inclusion, that all matters, right? Where we're starting from is a big part of where we're going to end up. So I encourage everybody to think about that from meeting students where they are in terms of their different potentials. Prior experience matters. The more you know, the more you can know. So the more we get used to learning and the more we experience different types of learning, the better that we can use those as a means to learn in the future. Our brain plasticity, of course, is important. And to me, this is essential. Learning is fluid and dynamic. We never stop learning. But I love to say there's no such thing as done in the classroom. And that's important because we are constantly building on what we know and what we are already learning. The memory plus attention equals learning. That comes back around to the prompt I gave you earlier, which is to take pen and paper to make some notes today. Because as we engage different parts of our bodies and our brains and what's happening, the stronger our ability is to retain that learning. So it's important for us to have this. And I talk about the neuroscience because this isn't just because I think it's a good idea to have individualized learning that connects global education, but it's important to know that the neuroscience supports it as well. I'm going to move now into this conversation about meaningful assessment so that we don't lose track of time. And if you are looking at the whole screen here, depending on how you're viewing it and what you can see, I think that it's really important to think about why we assess learning, what that means to us, right? So for all practical purposes, meaningful assessment should have everything to do with how well do we retain what we've got and how are we able to use those skills, right? But tests are not necessarily doing that. And if you look at the series of pictures that I have up here, meaningful assessment to me means, is it useful as I go out into the world? These are all just places that I've been to and places that I've traveled. And I can guarantee that there was not one single test I took in all of my education, all the way up through even my master's degree in learning. I didn't have anything that taught me about how to experience the rest of the world. Even if we're starting to do some cultural understandings or looking at different practices, there was no way for me to know if I was going to be able to not just survive, but thrive and have the essential skills necessary to be able to move throughout the world, right? And so when we think about meaningful assessment, think about it in that perspective of where does this translate to or transfer to in the world? And how can we start to get to the core of students, get them to build their own learning so that not only do they have ownership of that process and the development of it, but they have ownership of that assessment piece as well. And that assessment piece is really strong if they have a part of that conversation. Back in 1933, John Dewey spoke about critical thinking for education. And he was talking about the idea that the critical thinking itself was not just used, but there was the standards of discipline that came along with it. And he said, it is active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge. Supposed form of knowledge is key. In the light of the grounds that support it and the further conclusions to which it can tends to constitute reflective thought. All of that John Dewey quote has to me to say, the nutshell version of it, is that we have to be thinking about our learning and reflecting on that process as we go all the way through. So as we get into this conversation about meaningful assessment, I want to set our brains right in terms of how are we learning to learn so that we can grow and adapt and continue to learn. If we're really in this for the true goal, what is the big purpose of education? It's not just that we're learning facts and knowledge, it's that we are learning how to learn for the rest of our lives, right? So with that in mind, I don't know if it's going to let me, there we go. We're going to move into this conversation about what do test scores tell us? And so the answer is not much. We know that. If you're here because you're curious and you want to live curious. And so you're incorporating that into your classroom. And so you're already doing this. But when it comes to finding meaningful assessment steps, I know that we have to think about our institutions, we have to think about our organizational goals, and we have to appeal to what matters from that level. But we also have to think about it from that level of how are we learning how to learn? And so for me, in the individualized process and in the classroom where we're building critical thinking steps, I want us to be able to cultivate ownership of the learning process. And when I asked you the question at the top of this hour of what are you thinking about today, already you have some ownership in this process. When you went into your breakout groups, not only was I not in there regulating what you were talking about, but I was also not even holding you accountable when you came back into the room in terms of like, what did you talk about? I shared a little bit of what I heard, but it's your own conversation. That's your own learning process, your own learning journey today. So we've already cultivated a little bit of that ownership. When it comes to cultivating that ownership in the classroom, how can you ask those same questions of your students? What are you thinking about today? Or what do you want to be learning? Or how should we approach this? Even when it comes to something that you think there is only one way in, I guarantee your students will have another way in. I taught geometry for a long time, and asking students how they were able to enter into any of the geometric principles often included something related to physics, something in their lives, surfing, perhaps it was their other math classes, or even just something as simple as a game that they were playing, like Minecraft, right? So geometry became important because then they had an access point and an entry point of it. I love the second bullet point here is really important for this. Be clear on the why of learning. The more you can pull back the curtain and show students what you're doing and why you're doing it, the better it's going to be in terms of them having ownership of their learning. If they're in charge of it, if they have something to say about it, if they know why they're doing it, they're going to move in the direction that is a little bit more purposeful and meaningful to them, and they'll be able to engage a lot more too. When it comes to how you decide what assessments you're going to do, you want to be thinking about clear, tangible skills and thinking. So specifically, if you're going to be trying to assess something, what are you assessing? What are you trying to get to? What is the key thing, the key outcome that you're getting there? Sometimes it's one particular content area, but you've got to really be clear about that in the whole process so that it's the why is important. But what are the tangible skills? What is the thinking that is necessary? And it's often going to be surprising to you what students are taking away from the day, right? Practicing critiques with low stakes works. In terms of my steps for individualized learning and the basics of that process, step one is do critiques early and do them often, as well as repeatedly. So that includes feedback circles, getting into some feedback protocols. We all know them. We've seen them a bunch of times today already. But if you're not sure, there are lots of different ways to find that work out there in the world. Just Google critique protocols and you'll have some ways of doing that. But getting students used to doing it early and often takes away some of that stigma of this is going to be high stakes and you're going to be graded on this all the time. What that leads to is more formative assessment processes where students are able to then reflect and think about how that leads to more thinking, right? So for example, you prompt them with a journal question at the end of a conversation or a feedback session of, okay, what did you learn that you need to now work on for whatever it is that you're working on? So if you're doing some critique protocols with a writing sample, for instance, then you're asking students to give each other some feedback on that, asking them to reflect then afterwards, as a writer, what are you now thinking about and what can you take forward to improve your work and your thinking in the future? Reflections, informative thinking are really important for this part of the process. So that's kind of the nutshell version on assessment, but I want to make sure that we understand why we are thinking about this stuff. Okay, so here's a very, very big slide full of questions, and I'm going to leave this up here for the whole time while I talk about it, but it's my way of entering into the conversation about critical thinking. I'm going to be very transparent about my why here, the reason I'm doing all of this work, the reason that I do individualized learning, and the reason I'm in this conversation today is because I want there to be better critical thinking in the world from everybody. I think this is something that has become a lost art. I think that we have not done a good job of thinking about what critical thinking means. We all want it to be happening, but we sort of hope that it's like the hopeful byproduct of learning. We're like, oh, we hope critical thinking happens. I would encourage you to break it down and find a way to make critical thinking a part of direct instruction in your classroom. So what you see on this slide, so if you're interested in just kind of, you can screenshot this, you can have it, I can send it to you, but you can find all of this work from the Foundation for Critical Thinking. It's an organization here in the US that works on this, but it is an international organization, and this year is their 40th, I think, or 39th annual International Critical Thinking Conference. So they've been going for a long time in this process, and Dr. Richard Paul and Dr. Linda Elder put together this work. He did this work long before anybody else was doing it, but he put it together in a way that made sense. There are lots of different options about how to teach critical thinking, so you can Google all the different ways. This is the model that I use. When it comes to the evolving role of educators, we have to think about who we are and why we're doing what it is that we do. So we're going to get into this conversation in a minute. I'm going to ask you to actually answer this question of what is the purpose of being an educator, or what is the evolving role of educators. But when you walk through this conversation, you see here, we look at questions related to purpose, concept, key questions or issues that we're considering, points of view, assumptions, information and facts, data, and then, of course, inferences. So what are some of the interpretations that we can make, leading us in the right directions and eliminating those misdirections? And then what are some of the implications of our thinking? So these are the elements of critical thinking that I work from. You should find your own, but this is an example of how you can incorporate critical thinking into the work that you're doing towards a more global mindset in an individualized process. We'll get to that in just a second. But for right now, I'm just going to ask us for just 4 minutes, and I'm going to randomly assign you again. But the question is, what is the evolving role of an educator? Okay, so as I'm getting there, you should be already jotting down some notes for yourself. As I send you out into the breakout groups, I'm putting the question in the chat. If you want to grab it, copy it so that you can take it with you into the breakout rooms. That's a great idea, but I'll also broadcast it out to the breakout rooms. But I want you just to discuss for 4 minutes, what is the evolving room of an educator? Welcome if you're just joining us. Everybody just went into breakout rooms. Apologies for the timing, but if you can, if you can see in the chat, we're having a conversation about the evolving role of an educator. So if you're still in this room with me, you're welcome to jump into that conversation with me a little bit. I'm happy to have that conversation with you. Or I can also send you into the rooms if you prefer to have that conversation with other people. So is it Grisha and is it Scotty?
Hi, well, I just got here because I was changing rooms, but it seems very interesting. What I could gather from this is that, well, I'm a sixth grade teacher.
Sure.
And that's something that I have been thinking a lot recently. I see my students, I know they're struggling with all this digital and distance learning scenario, right? But even though all of those circumstances, I keep on asking myself, when I'm in the classroom and when I'm in a digital classroom, how can I invite them, or how can I, let's say, create these experiences that could help them develop critical thinking? Because I find myself with them, struggling with very small things and having these oh, what am I going to do, teacher? What am I going to do with these small, things? And I'm like, okay, just let's take a deep breath. Let's figure it out. What can we do, And so this is something that I question myself every day. Okay, is it just distance learning, or when we were in classroom, this happened the same way, and what can I do?
From the classroom experience, there are always those chaotic moments. So of course it can happen in the digital world as well as in person. You never know how things are going to turn out. But our capacity in the evolving role of an educator, our capacity to be able to just slow down, pause, ask a meaningful question, ask them what's happening, and ask them to problem solve with you. So the goal of this whole conversation, and my whole reason for being in education, is that individualized mindset. So getting the students to be part of the problem solving is a really, that's the big part of it. Or, okay, you guys, this isn't, here's where we're at. So what are you thinking about this topic or this idea or what's happening? Or what are you thinking about this activity, and how can we all make it better right now in this moment? And that empowerment is so important and so powerful. I did some research and presented on student engagement this past fall, and there was a lot of study and a lot of research I did over what's been happening during the pandemic, but also the past 10 years of student engagement. And the answer didn't change from 10 years ago to what was happening in the pandemic. It's that rapport, and it's that making people feel like they're being heard. Right.
Totally.
So, So anybody else? So I didn't want to get too long into that conversation, but those of you who are still in this room with us, what is your answer to that question of what is the evolving role of an educator?
I'd consider, I don't know what was said before. I came in
we're all just everybody else is in a breakout room.
So the evolving role. I think more and more, I've been in education a long time, licensed teacher for 26 years, but I started my career with after school programming, and I don't know what anybody else knows about that, but because I felt like making that real connection early on was something I wanted to do. And so now that education's kind of caught up with life and play and not just those kind of elements that I enjoyed, that drew me to that field early on. And then I taught PE for 10 years. And now I've been in the classroom for the rest of them. and still adding those elements of life, coaching, observing, encouraging kids, no matter what that is. And so I think that switch that we've made in the last, I don't know, at least 10 years now, that evolving more towards having kids have these real experiences and creating these real experiences.
Yeah. I love that real
That's all I gotta
experience.
say about that.
No, I love it. Thank you. Thanks you guys for staying in the room with me. It's fun to have that conversation with people. Everybody else is going to be coming back into the main room in just 1 second, and we'll continue on the conversation. But thanks so much for what you're sharing and for jumping into this conversation. The idea that learning has to be serious and productive is, I love that you bring that up, that like, this is not what it's about. Like, we're not in school or in education because everything is always so serious and so dire. We have to be playing. We have to find a way to lighten up a little bit and have a little bit of fun with it. Yeah. For me, when I think about the critical thinking part of it, I feel like that feels heavy for a lot of people, but it's also a really easy way to get into the conversations. When in the classroom, when I am working on the whole mindset of critical thinking, I start with something really, really simple, such as, let's do some critical thinking about pizza. And I have never once in a room full of people not had an engaging discussion about critical thinking related to pizza and how that fits in. Sorry, I don't know, Scotty, if you were saying something, you were on mute still, but that, like, being able to have a meaningful conversation with I just saw that in the chat, with critical thinking about pizza, you can have something serious about something light. It encourages that thinking process with something that's easy. Right, so Angela had this conversation, but there was a little bit of a question here with the guidelines and IB scores, and I understand that that's part of it, but one of the ways that you can access all of these different modalities. Sorry, there was a question in the chat I'm answering about pressing with scores and IB scores and guidelines. So in the classroom, I had students doing 53 different courses at the same time in one semester with me. And they were doing things that were related to very serious topics with math and science and English and social studies, humanities, but they were also doing it in a way that mattered to them and that goes onto the college transcript. And to be realistic about this, when you think about where they're headed for universities and what universities are moving to now, I know that this is beginning worldwide, but here in the United States, even, they're throwing out standardized test scores as a means to weed out students. So the capacity to learn and own your own learning for students, I think, is more powerful than we can even imagine. Sorry, I don't know what just happened there. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for going into your different chat rooms and having these conversations. It's really important for us to, sorry, I'm having a little difficulty seeing. I'm gonna close. I can't even see my own screen. That's okay. What I'm gonna do right now is throw something into the chat that is just a document for you to start to use. You'll see that when you open it, it just goes straight to make a copy of it. The thing that you're gonna see in this is a guide that I use. It's called the Lists of Lists in the Project Thinking Template. And when I think about this process of individualized learning, but also our own continuing education as educators and the practical standards, I think that it's really important for us to think about our own journeys as learners. So this is the template that I use with all of my individualized students. It's been open source for years, so no reason for it not to be now. If you want some help in how to use this tool, then you are more than welcome to engage with me. Just send me an email, and find me on Twitter, whatever it takes to be able to talk about this stuff. But I'm happy to coach you through this process for yourself. Sorry, it should have open sharing. Oh no. Okay, I'm gonna go fix that sharing while we start to have this conversation. I'm gonna stop the share real quick here so that you can all get access to that document. Apologies on that. But when it comes to this conversation about individualized learning, critical thinking, meaningful assessment, the goal is, how are you going to change your classroom practices in order to be able to bring about some of this learning. I think that it's really important to understand that it's all about you and how you're entering into the process. All right, gang, everybody that was having trouble connecting and finding it there, see if that helps you a little bit as I move back into the conversation here. Yes, we getting a yes? Okay, good, yay. Technical difficulties, yay. Okay, thanks for everybody for hanging in there and being mindful and supportive while we got through this part of the process. So we're at the end anyway. But what I'd like for you to think about is this major question here. And I would really love to see some of these in the chat if you know for sure. What is one action you will take towards the education revolution and what school could be that would enlist you in your quest? So this conversation really comes down to what are you going to do and who are you going to take along on this journey with you? So for example, when you open up that list of lists in the project thinking template, if you go all the way down to the question of what is your goal and what is your objective, I think it's really important for us to be thinking about why we're doing what we're doing and what we're trying to do, right? So in this conversation about our learning and our education revolution, what are we trying to change? So for example, one of the things that I got from this morning's conversation, and it was a powerful one, even though it was really early for me at 5 o'clock in the morning. But when Will Richardson was talking a little bit about what was happening in this process, he asked the question, what are we willing to fight for? And I thought about that and I took that to heart. So that's the one thing that I'm going to be taking into my education revolution in the coming weeks. What am I really standing up and fighting for? I feel really strongly about the equity piece of the puzzle and making sure that things are there, but I'm not sure I'm doing any action specifically to make sure that there is equitable practice in my work. So now, my week, I'm going to start to look at where is there inequity in my work and how can I include more people in what's happening with what I'm doing. So I have a very small set of my audience and people that I've gotten to. So my action is asking that question for myself. What am I going to fight for? How am I going to include equity in the classroom a little bit more? So I'm just going to go through the chat here and start to see. So what is one action you're going to be taking towards the education revolution? Take my students in both Massachusetts and the Dominican Republic to challenge them on a quest and not just working on getting good test scores. I want them to challenge me and ask questions. Well done, Juan. That is an awesome one. Start asking questions. What is sacred and what am I willing to do to fight for that? Thank you. I believe it's Dottie. I hope I don't say it wrong. Eva says she's going to challenge herself and try new teaching strategies. That's awesome. Involve students in creating criteria in grade 5 with exhibition. Yes. Authentic audiences matter. That is a really big part of this process. Fantastic word. Awesome. What else, gang? What are you taking out into the revolution? I'm popping up in here my works cited page. I'll leave it up for a second for you to capture this if you want to go back and read everything that I've read to get to this place in my learning journey. But I'm also happy to send it to anyone. You're welcome to find me, to contact me at any time. I'm all over the place. Clean up my messy individualized learning path. If you want some help in that, guy, I'm your girl. I definitely have this whole process. I have a lot of different tools for it. Giving students a choice in how they show and show what they know and what they've learned. Yes, that modality matters. Give myself time to think about what I can improve on without being distracted. Maybe 1 hour a week or something on the notes or the notepad. We were encouraged earlier today to use Post-its, so not a bad idea to have that with you all the time. Try to install curiosity in my students so that they want to learn for pleasure and not obligation. I love it. How can we instill that passion? Students are having an exchange with students in Portland and they're challenging themselves in their Zoom meetings about the exhibition. That's amazing. That cross-cultural learning is so powerful. Fair, give more choices to my students to make learning their own despite the standardized lessons and assessments I need to have completed. Go beyond that. Thank you very much for that, Fair. We're down to the last 4 minutes and I promised you time for questions. So I want to make sure to open that up for that now. But if not, you're welcome to continue to tell me what you're going to do. you can see up on the screen there, you can find me, my website, which is pretty minimal. It's not anything fantastic. So, you know, fair warning there. I'm still working on that part of the process, but you can find me, Susannah, at individualizedrealized.com. I'm happy to answer stuff. If you want a copy of this presentation, I'm happy to send that to you as well. As working on that individualized learning process, I'm happy to walk through that with you as well. And then, of course, if you have any questions about the other businesses that I'm working on, specifically the Personalized Learning Network is a really big part of my day right now, and trying to connect students from all different parts of the world in global learning. I'm happy to share that information with you too. Scotty's gonna challenge students to lead their learning. Yes, what are they gonna learn and why are they gonna learn it? I love it. Allowing students to decide within their learning quest. Yeah, you know what you need to do. There are standards, there are essential skills, and that content doesn't go unnoticed. I understand that. And I know I went really quickly through that part of it, but within the individualized process, I do take time to look at what are the content standards, what are the essential skills that they need to, but having students look at that with us and determine what they're going to be learning, what they're going to be working on matters, right? If they're looking at humanities stuff, of course, research matters. Of course, communication matters, written communication, oral communication. But what are the ways that they are going to enter into it? And maybe they're already good at some aspects of the humanities and they don't need to spend as much time on that part of it. Maybe they're excellent researchers already and they know how to disseminate the terrible information from the quality information. So why spend time teaching them how to do that? Ask them what they need to learn within each area, and that's going to help you to fine tune the direction that they head. Finding a way to get my students to learn any way they can and forget about scores. Wouldn't that be beautiful? If all of our students and parents forgot about scores, imagine how beautiful learning would be and how awesome that would feel to everybody, right? So that's the direction I'm headed. That's where I want to go. I would encourage you to continue to find that for yourself. Any other questions or thoughts before our final minutes? I hope that you were able to find some meaningful conversation within your breakout groups in terms of what happens. I would love to hear from you. You can even shout it out on Twitter, or you can email me directly. What is the evolving role of an educator? I think that's one of the most important things we need to think about. This has been a terribly hard 12 plus months for educators. We're all really doing our best and working very hard. So find a reason to celebrate the fact that you remain curious, that you remain engaged, and you remain committed. So start with that, just celebrate that for yourselves, but also recognize that you're already doing awesome things. So thank you for engaging in these conversations today. And I just saw that we had a note that the breakout rooms are office and that was nice to have these global conversations. That's why I'm here too. So I look forward to hearing from many of you and chatting with you in the future. I'm really very appreciative that you showed up today, and I look forward to talking with all of you and continuing on this journey together as a global community. So thank you, everybody. Thanks a lot for all of your time.